Whether you are a seasoned pro sewist or someone who's just starting out on their sewing and design journey, this video is going to show you how to draft a perfectly fitting neckline, ribbing, or binding piece. Now, this is not a standard method that's taught in schools. I want you to know that this method is my own method, which I have found to be pretty accurate over the years. Instead of getting a gaping neckline that just doesn't lie well against the body, or lots of puckering, let's try to dial in that fit to get it perfect every time. And as a special bonus, I'm going to be sharing with you a special calculator that'll help calculate the stretch percentage of that neckline ribbing piece. You can find that link in the description below. This tutorial was taken directly from my Mastering Garment Ease course, where we study the stretch of the fabrics and how to get the perfect amount of negative or wearing ease in the patterns. I thought this part might be helpful for you, so that's why I'm sharing it. So why is drafting that neckline binding so important? Well, we want to reduce the amount of gaping or puckering that's on the seam. So this is why it's so critical in drafting this in the correct method. Whether or not you're drafting for a ribbing or a binding, the actual process is the exact same. The difference comes in the sewing and the workmanship. So here you can see that this is a binding. It's wrapped around to the back of the garment and it's folded in on both sides. So it's more like it's binding the neckline versus this option. So actually, if we look at the front of the neckline here, it's a little bit easier to see. We have a closer edge stitch next to the seam, and this is the ribbing piece that was just folded over and sewn to the seam. So it's not binding the edge. It's more like it's set into the seam. So this comes down to a workmanship difference. This is another style where the ribbing is standing out away from the body. It's not resting close to the body here, and it was definitely not drafted in the way that I'm going to show you in this video. Binding, since it wraps over the edge, tends to be a maximum of about 1/2 inch, which is 1.3 centimeters. Ribbing can be even wider, up to about 1 inch in width, 2.5 centimeters. The word trim or neck trimming could refer to either workmanship. So now I want to show you how to draft this pattern piece so it lies exactly against the body perfectly. To make a new neckline ribbing, the first thing you have to do is decide the height that you want. And you can always refer back to the original pattern and figure out the height. So the boat neckline on this example, we can measure out first the seam allowance on each end, and then whatever that distance is in between, we take the halfway point. That's the height of our ribbing. So this is the fold line, the center fold of the ribbing. And whatever that height is of the ribbing, we need to mark it on our pattern away from the seam line. So for this example, it was the 3/8 of an inch, which is 1 centimeter. And that ends up being my seam allowance edge that I've already marked here. We're going to mark out the extension of that shoulder seam all the way out to the cut line there. Then the next step is to measure the pattern, and we're going to measure it without that seam allowance at the shoulder seam. And by measuring the fold line, this becomes the fold line of the ribbing, we're getting the actual measurement, what the ribbing should be. Whatever that measurement is, I want you to go back to a piece of paper and draft out that length. So we're going to draft out the height, which is 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, and the length of what you measured. That's your cut line. Okay, so 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter gets me to my fold line here, and I need to double that because that's on the fold, and that's my ribbing piece. It's my center back, this is my center front. I would generally put this on the fold here. Most of the time you're actually doubling the pattern piece so that it's one long piece. Then it's a little bit easier. We also need to add seam allowances to it and our notches. So whatever the seam allowance is on the body piece, you want to mimic that same amount, and consider that the center front is on the fold, so we don't need seam allowance there. Then we need to figure out our notches. To find out the perfect notches, it's actually the best way is to mark out a notch wherever you think kind of that curve is starting, and the distance can vary. You can place it really anywhere, but I really like to do that this way instead of measuring out the amounts and dividing it by 4 or something, because we're going to get the smaller amount in the curve where we want it to rest against the body correctly. If we were to take this total amount here and here and just divide them, and then take this amount and divide that, let's say by 3 or 4 or something, or even by 2, then we would get different amounts of ease in different areas. So by marking out where we want those notches to be, and I'm going to also mark one here at the shoulder seam, then we can really direct the curve and the ease in the curved areas where we want it to go. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark that notch all the way through the seam line and all the way to the edge, wherever that fold of the rib is going to be. And I'm going to measure this amount here. From that amount, that's my center front, I'm going to mark that amount here. Right there. Then we measure the next line along that fold all the way to the next notch, which I'm going to remember that I like to notch right at that seam line. And then I have the next one, which I'll go from the center back hopefully the last one is measuring pretty close. So we're good there. So those are my notches. I'm going to extend those notches down to my cut line. And I would fold over the center front, and that would be it. The only thing is I have to remember that one of my notches is at the shoulder seam. So one of those alignment points on the pattern. And generally, unless you really mark it and you cut that notch, it can be easy to forget that. But once you're sewing, it's pretty easy. Once you've drafted that neck ribbing piece or binding piece, the next important thing is to check the stretch factor. We want to do this to make sure that we're not stretching too much in very curved areas. Generally, this tends to be in the high point shoulder area, but it really could be anywhere on the neckline depending on the shape. We do this check so that we're not overstretching, which causes the trim to roll along the edges, or it can cause excessive puckering on the seam. Additionally, if you're using a fabric that doesn't stretch much, then you might have a difficulty because it can't stretch into the neckline with a low stretch factor. So this step has to do directly with negative ease of the trim piece compared to the body piece. So make sure you've downloaded that free stretch factor calculator and go through these steps with me. So the biggest thing we need to do for checking a stretch factor from the ribbing of the neckline to the seam line is checking the area that has the smallest measurement for the fold line compared to the seam line. So on this pattern, you can see this to this are pretty much the same, and even this to this is not a huge difference. So we definitely don't have to worry about the stretch factor for those two positions, but the area here to here and here to here, you can use the plug and play calculator for the stretch percentage. We can utilize this calculator when we're determining the neckline measurements. And we can plug in the amount of the fold here, this measurement that we've measured,
plug in that measurement for amount relaxed, because that's the amount relaxed of this piece. Then we can plug in the amount stretched is that measurement along the seam line. Plug in that measurement and check to see what that percentage is between the two. We want to be able to not have too much stretch compared to the stretch factor of the fabric that you've selected. And the same goes for the back neckline here. This is probably going to be the biggest difference between one and the other, and it could mean that maybe this amount is just going to be too different from this amount, meaning it could cause some puckers down here, or it could cause this to roll as you stretch it to sew it in. So in this case, if you plug in the relaxed measurement of 2 inches or 5 centimeters, and then we plug in the stretched measurement of 2.5 inches or 6.3 centimeters, we can see the difference. We end up with a stretch percentage of 25%. Now, if your fabric only stretches 25%, that's going to be too much for you to stretch that in, because it's going to cause this to roll too much. What you can do is you can shift the notch over just a little bit to kind of balance it between the two, because this part doesn't really need to stretch much, and we can bump the notch over a little bit, and then we can double check and see, okay, does this measurement going into this measurement fit okay with that stretch percentage, and then that new measurement to this, is that okay? That's kind of how we move the notches around to get the notches in the correct position, that we're not overstretching it. A good starting point for the maximum percentage of stretching the neck piece into the seam would be about half of the percentage of the stretch factor.
I hope you've learned a lot from this. I do have one more tip that's really, really important here. Make sure you're always pre-washing your fabrics. If you don't pre-wash that fabric and it shrinks, that can also lead to excessive puckering on that neck seam. I'm Gina Renee, and I absolutely love teaching online pattern making courses so that you can design and sew the clothes you love that fit. I have a fantastic free webinar talking more about negative ease and wearing ease. I'd love to see you there. You can click the link below to register for that free webinar, Mastering Garment Ease. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, like it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.